Hi, so I wanted to make this video to talk about, so the clickbait title is How to Fix NA/LCS Analyst Desk and Casting. Obviously, there's not that much wrong with it already. And also, it's not the NA/LCS anymore. It's just LCS. And also, I'm going to talk about LEC, but, it's the internet, so I have to clickbait. All right, so I have a longer video than this where I kind of ramble and I was like collecting my thoughts, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I think it kind of like is a lot more clarifying for me necessarily than for the watcher about my thoughts on the topic. So I'll link that in the description down below, and you can check out the long video of it if you like. Otherwise, I'm going to post this. It's going to be unlisted, by the way, so you can't see it on my channel, but I'm going to post this like synopsis essentially of the main points for a TLDW of the entire topic, hopefully keeping it a little bit shorter. So without further ado, let me jump into it. Yeah, so I'm going to start just with the context of the setup. So there was this Euphoria podcast that Froscurin, Vettius, and Ender did, which was fantastic. And by the way, I recommend their podcast. I've never seen it before, so I always listened to it. I always watched the dive on YouTube, and I always listened to Euphoria on my headphones, like when I was biking around. And I thought that I had an idea of what the set looked like, basically from hearing the building of the set over all of the episodes. As they're like adding props and having these funny settings where they're bringing stuff in, and then I got to see it finally, and I realized that it looks like a podcast should. It looks like the community is being built around like inside information, inside jokes, and like memes, and the decorations that entail like this community, and everybody kind of like knows what all this stuff is and where it came from. So not to crap on the dive too much, but like if you want a podcast like The Breakfast Club, which is like the end all be all standard of morning shows, I feel like Euphoria is kind of like heading in that direction, and the dive looks very clean, crisp, kind of like talking head, robotic, always the same kind of setup. So anyway, I just thought that was really cool. I had no idea that there was such a different style. Although I kind of got the picture of it from the audio, but I never really got to see it visually. Okay, so anyway, they had a really great podcast, and I have a rundown of like all the stuff they talked about here, which I can go through very quickly. And then the great thing is that there's been this like a little bit of drama between Sneaky and casters and analysts in NA, and this historically has always cropped up. Like there was the Dyrus thing when he was retiring, when he said he was going to explain like the big problem with casting, which is that they get stuff wrong and it ruins pro players' brands when they say the thing that is completely incorrect from what actually happens in the game. But they don't put enough effort into doing it right, or they don't accept the mantle of their responsibility. That was kind of like his assertion, but after he retired, he didn't really go into it that much. He didn't become the ambassador that he was like saying that he was going to do tell all, or else he couldn't like elucidate it like very clearly at the time. Although he did bring it up at points, and then throughout the years, it's been kind of like touched upon here and there. So we know that there's this like dynamic between casting and analytics and their impact with the fans on pro player brands and perception of pro players, and then the actual things that happen in the game, and that what the casters say and what actually happened isn't really always connected. Like, isn't always the same thing, right? There's reality and perception. And I think the best example of it actually came from the Euphoria podcast, where Ender was talking about how for casters, it's kind of like the difference between the balance team, where the balance team is working with an entirely different understanding and perception of balance than what Reddit is working with, because there's a huge data discrepancy between the balance team and Reddit in terms of how much data the balance team has access to in the game from the developers, which are them. And then he's saying like this similar way for casters. Caster criticism from Reddit, they're working with a lot less data than casters have. Casters are getting feedback from their bosses and from their coworkers, and they're understanding how much effort they put into working on the game, and how much they decided to not say certain catchphrases and stuff like that, and et cetera, and stuff that they've squared away with other pros. And Reddit doesn't really Like there's Reddit's perception and then there's reality. And I think it's very similar for what's happening in game. There's like caster perception and analyst perception, and then there's reality. And because pros have access to a lot more data about the game, and casters don't have access to that, or analysts don't have access to that, there's a discrepancy. So I think this example applies really well. So I really liked it. So let me now essentially go through the problem as I see it. So first of all, the not problems. The not problems are casters do a really good job for Riot, and they do a really good job on the product, at least LSCS and LEC, which is, I think, really great. Like, I think we have some of the best or the best casters in the industry. I think that it's really entertaining to listen to, and I always am going back and listening to the cast, and they put in a lot of work, and they're very professional, and they try very hard, and they understand their mission, which is to create a fantastic product for Riot Games, to create viewership, to create value, and to create brand for the product, and then for pros if they can, and for Riot in particular. And also, the not problem is that casters work for Riot first, and the LCS and LEC product first or second. In other words, for the fans. And this is because Riot is a player-focused and a fan-focused company. And that's kind of like in their charter or whatever, like players first. And nowadays in esports, it's kind of like fan first, I would assume. So the product is designed for them, not for necessarily for the pro players or for the coaches or for like that. Okay, so let's get into the problems as I see it, which is that casters have to do a lot of work if they want to do adequate analysis, like an exorbitant amount of work, which personally is a problem and not a problem as far as I see it, because pros also have to do an insane amount of work, but burnout is real, and we don't want our casters to like burn out necessarily, or there are more efficient ways of doing work that allow them to be better at their job with less time invested, which means that they can be even better at their job because they're investing less time, so they can take the extra time and do it, right? And then what's really happening in game and what's casted isn't always correct. So there's a problem when the thing that they say isn't really what happened. Like, for example, a person overextending, well, maybe his team told him to, and he's like, but I'll die, and they were like, do it anyway. So he does, and then, oh, this player overextended, right? So that's just a simple example, but it doesn't really matter to the fans or the product or to Riot. It's pretty relevant because it's all, to the outside perspective, observed, right? But it can be and is very frustrating for pro players when a larger section of what is said is not accurate to in-game, and therefore there's perceptions of pros that build up that is not necessarily correct. So that's the real problem. And like I said, it's not really a big deal because it's not really a big problem, because the caster's job is for Riot and for LCS and for LEC first, not to like properly and correctly represent pro players. Although if they could, that would be amazing, right? That's actually our job, is orgs and coaches, is to build player brand and represent them and put out content and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's a way for a win-win on this, essentially, where casters can do less work to have more results in terms of their analysis and their preparation, and also to get closer to like the narrative to be closer to reality, because the data gap will be closed. And I think it's kind of crazy that we don't already do this, which is why I want to bring it up. I think the solutions are that casters should be visiting teams. This is something that I brought up in 2016 when I came to NA as a coach, and it was kind of shot down by the teams in general because they didn't want the data, the infosec, the information security problem of leaking like information out that would either benefit other teams or possibly get leaked in terms of draft, etc. And then when I went to Europe, I found out that it was common practice there. Deficio and Crepo were like over watching scrims, and they were better casters as a result. And the movement of the idea of concept of tempo, which was invented, I think, in the pro community in 2017, originating in Korea, working its way to the West, to Europe through Katowice 2017. Essentially, like, and then working into our scrim, like, conversations and review there, and then working into the cast. I noticed Deficio started using it after talking to pro players in Europe and seeing scrims and kind of hearing it bandied about. I think that this is like a good thing, and I don't think that there's a I think that there's ways of overcoming the problems of information security and casters being in the room watching scrimmages that are pretty easy to deal with. And I think that essentially, if we had this back and forth flow of ideas where casters could come and watch scrimmages and take notes, it would deal with one of these issues that Vettius brought up in the podcast here, which, if you want to listen to, by the way, there's a link right here. It's season 4, episode 6, starts at 45 minutes. And Vettius brings up this point where he's like, people say I don't do analysis, but I spent like 5 hours preparing and with this guy, and we went to a whiteboard and we broke down all the ways we can do 1-through-1s and 1-0-4s, and we were at it for hours. And I think that, like, while that's admirable, I bet that you could have gleaned. I bet that, first of all, some of the ideas you came up with were probably wrong, and you probably could have done this in 30 minutes if you had a full access to a pro who had to give you 100% of their time and explain everything to you, or who was in the room. And also, if you observed scrims for a couple days, I think that you would have picked up pretty much everything you needed to in terms of that, or you could have asked clarifying questions, and maybe it would have been like more efficient in terms of like use of your time, and it would have been like immediately more accurate to how the game is understood at the highest level by the people who are really good at it, with the pro players. And so that's commendable what he did, and I want it to be even more painless and more accurate, the result, in other words. And by the way, all casters do this. They spend hours and hours prepping, and I see it all the time, and I hear about it all the time. And I think, gosh, so much of that time could be recaptured if they wanted to just, if we were able to allow them to come and just observe scrims, and if they took notes and had access to pros to ask clarifying questions about the game. Okay, and the second thing I think is that I think the analyst desk in general could get a lot more accurate about the game if they were able to listen to comms and shot calls and draft. Then they could understand certain moves on the map and who's responsible for like it happening and how it kind of devolved by essentially like understanding the shot call situation. I think that there's a lot of situations that I noticed last split and this split where what was described by the casters and what was actually understood and done in game were like complete opposite. And draft, I think, would be similar too. So this is a lot thornier of a subject to handle because the analyst desk usually employs contractors. So while I trust Riot employees like completely, and the casters and Dash, the desk host, who would like come to scrims, and like I'm sure that they would be incredibly careful about keeping everything secret and really, really close to the chest, and they would find ways of like imparting all of that knowledge into the cast and making it like higher quality like for the pros. It's already high quality enough like for the fans. Making it high quality without revealing anything, because if they did, obviously they'd be canned probably, because that was a big no-no. I don't necessarily know how they would do that with contractors. Like, for example, Mark Z, while I'm sure he's a great guy, like he also hangs with a lot of people and isn't under the purview necessarily of Riot, and has a bunch of shows and stuff that he talks about a bunch of extra topics on. So I feel like I don't know how that would be handled. I'm sure there's a way to do it though. I'm sure there's the content crew already listens to the entire comms for the game and pulls out like key moments, and puts it as the talk on the desk and is very careful about that. Sorry, as the the mic check or whatever. So I'm sure there's a way to do it. And then finally, my last solution is that just understanding like the push and pull and building of team quality over the season. I think that pro players and pro team staff who are with scrimmages all day long every day throughout the week could, with like 99% accuracy, predict who's going to win on the weekend and why. And a lot of times it takes a lag of like a couple weeks or sometimes like many weeks for analysts to see in the results because of the way that competitive seasons work, like who's getting stronger and who's getting weaker. And I think that it would improve analysis a lot in terms of accuracy if they were able to know about that ahead of time. So this could be as easy as a survey that goes out, on Fridays to pro players, or like a 30-minute coffee with a team a week, alternating and rotating through to kind of like get the catch up news of what teams are looking strong and which teams are looking weak and what teams are on the upswing and the downswing. And I think that even fans like to hear about scrimmage talk, right? But teams are not really allowed to do that. It's not really like so polite. But if it was like anonymized through the casting desk, like it might be a really good way to spread around that content. So I think that these are three really simple things that are a win-win for both teams and pros. Maybe not for teams. Win-win for pros because the cast would be more accurate to their skill level and like what exactly they're good at in the game, and it would I would say like villainize the correct people and celebrate the correct heroes always, instead of like possibly villainizing a hero and heroizing a villain. And I'm not saying that like there are villains and heroes, right? But I'm saying that like that's how it works out in the narrative, and sometimes it's wrong, and it doesn't necessarily need to be wrong. It could just be right. It could be accurate if we wanted to do it this way. And I think it's a win-win for the casters because they get to do the same thing that they're doing, but more accurately and with less work. So those are my ideas. And yeah, I can't say that I put a ton of thought into this in terms of like how it would be played out, like what the details would be, but definitely it was functional in EU just fine, and I'm sure that there's a way to pull it off with Riot that would be beneficial for everybody. And like I said, I don't really think this is about the quality of the cast in terms of how it is presented to the fans and the product in general. I think it's more about my job, which is to make sure that pros are well represented and like what is said about them is accurate, and it would kind of close that gap, I feel like, that exists right now and has existed from the beginning, between what's casted and what's actually happening in the game. So yeah, that's what I have to think about it. That's what I have to say about it. What do you guys think? You should check it out and comment on Reddit. I suppose this will be a post at some point. And also, check out my Twitch channel where I do my daily show, Q&A show. Twitch.tv/MyGamesWeldon. See you guys later.